This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's raining outside. For those people who park on the News Gazette free parking lot, things have changed dramatically in the last little while. So I want to warn you that if you park on the News Gazette retired now parking lot, it's been cleared. Part of it, the problem I understand is that 3 parking lots have been places where people accumulate after the bars have closed. And last year where there was some shooting so involved. So I think the city is concerned. Janet, the new owner, has not been developing the News Gazette building yet, and she's been fairly tolerant of people parking there. But I think the city has encouraged her to tidy up the parking, and she's done so. So some people have been towed, including myself. So just be cautious if you're over there. We're not quite sure what's going on. There were 2 notices put up that are not very obvious, and then very shortly cars were being towed. So just a warning to lefties who often park in that lot that you better be cautious, and we don't know quite what. So warning there. I'm going to experiment again. We have been doing this with how do we put pictures in and how do we let the radio be verbal enough to be radio, and the Channel 6 television to be video enough to have pictures. Then we have to know how to put those pictures in. Zoom will allow that. We tried to put it in with Dropbox. It didn't work very well because the Dropbox puts your slides into your year, or the order gets screwed up. So we're using a slideshow, and we'll do this program as a dry run. I've been requested to speak for 15 minutes at Spurlock Museum on Earth Day, which this year is the 22nd of April. It's fairly organized program, and so our involvement was just 15 minutes. And we do hope to put in some pictures. The question that arises is, how did you get to be involved with multidimensional things, art, education, and science? And how do you fit that art into that thing? It's not usual that we do speak about the artist ourselves, but more and more it's being realized that storytelling is very helpful. It lets people understand who you are and what you do, and part of that is knowing who your parents are. So a little bit of my time will be spent saying something about my parents, and then you have to be you. And that's where we need to understand ourselves, and we have to understand how to work with the environment that we might be interested in, whether it's art or education or pure science. And then we have to figure out if you as a person who is interested, who is excited, has mission, can go and do something like you would find in a CEO. And we've been talking about that some, but we're desperately needing those people who have breadth and interest and excitement and can tell stories. So this is my attempt, and it will be modified for the program. I have people who are helping with this, and they want to see this few minutes recorded so that we can use it with other situations. A little bit of juggling with Macintosh computers and regularly Hewlett Packard computer, and how each one reacts. And then we are being helped in this with Havana Public Television. So in this case, it was a dry run. We are remembering pictures, and we'll get Boomer to put them in so that our Zoom program for now will go to a banner, and Boomer will send it to WEFT to be reproduced as a radio program. Then Boomer will put pictures in. In order to do that, we have to listen to the radio program and list the time. So somebody will be speaking about a picture at 15 minutes and 25 seconds, and that allows Boomer to put the picture in there. We have been using a Dropbox, but Dropbox disconvolvulates things some. So we found it's much simpler to just do it with a slideshow. And like many others, we're still learning. And yes, kind of fun. It takes time. Anything with video, and it takes very lot of time. So with a pause, I'm going to simulate what I might say for 15 minutes. It's a very short time, and I tend to talk, so I can easily go over. I've been asked to speak to this environmental meeting. It's Earth Day, the 22nd. And the request has been to tell people how I got involved with doing interdisciplinary things with many different topics, many different disciplines, and including art and biology or science and art, education, and science. First thing to think about is where you grew up. Who were your parents? We don't always think about our parents when we're growing up. From about 3 on, we're very dependent on our parents. They have to see that we don't get run over by a car, or that we won't put our finger in the oven or do silly things. So we're learning constantly, and it's kind of a game. If you watch a child learning, they're always doing, thinking. The time they get to 13 and puberty, they're starting to think about what they are doing, what they might want to do, and who are they? And they're not quite certain. Some of us are still not quite certain when we're older, but they have a problem with surging hormones and knowing the difference between the genders, and so then there's an age when you actually are 18, 19, 20, 25, where you sort of have an idea where you want to go, and you've found people who are exciting to work with. That doesn't always happen. We're getting better at that. Beckman Center, a huge center with the University of Illinois, is good at doing that and bringing groups together. But not always do people happen in upon the thing they would like to do, whether it's music or art or science. Sometimes you're lucky and you can follow through on the work of previous people as an assistant and then move into the field. At other times, you have to be the creator. And when it's new topic, it's going to be hard because you're going to be at the peak of this study, then you don't know what you're doing, and you don't have many associates that know what you're doing either or what they're doing. So it's very important to us to come together, whether it's by Zoom or in a meeting, to bring people of similar ilk together so that they can get excited about each other, shout at each other, and argue about each other in a sensible fashion. As you get older, you have developed some of these skills, and you can write books, you can write stories, and that's where sometimes stories come in. And so a lot of the stories that you hear are about people who have had interesting careers, but have never really said much about them to the public. This is especially so for people who have been in war zones. They don't usually enjoy getting letting people know what they had to go through. But if you're a good listener and you ask good questions, then you're likely to have people who will open up to you. But you almost have to be part of the family to get certain information. And if you listen to a very good interpreter, that's where it is. So my parents my mother was born in England, in Cockney, London, and before World War II, just the turn of the 17th century, and the family decided to come to Australia. My grandfather was a tailor, and my mother grew up as a seamstress, but she also went to college with art. So she was both an artist and a seamstress. She worked with a friend of the family named Millie Thornborough, and Millie had 18 seamstresses, and mother was kind of in charge. Part of her responsibility was to go to the races and sketch recent model dresses or hats, and come back and create a line that was a less expensive line of clothing. Father grew up he was born at the end of the 18th century, and he was in an era when there were lots of children. They were being used as workforces, but they were also being used to populate countries like Australia and New Zealand were white Australian countries at one stage. They didn't want to have hordes from the north invading. So the churches were big. churches were the center of the communities. They would have gymnasiums and godly people, but it was very much a place where people went, whether you were in a city or in a rural setting. My father grew up with a number of different jobs, carpentry. He worked with a glass person at one stage, and he was part of the church, study for the Congregational Church, and was assigned to a church for 5 years. At that point, he was getting to realize that his interest in the church was more seeing it as an institution for teaching moral code. Some of that sort of thing has now gone to education and schools. But he felt that his congregation was more involved with godliness than he was. So he pulled out and went to teaching. And so he also was an eclectic person. He knew how to garden. He knew how to he taught himself how to drive a car, and 1928 Whippet. And he would teach. But as a teacher, he also was responsible for voting behaviors, booze and things like that. But because he had a number of different jobs and was a little older, he ended up in the boondocks, and my mother and he were in a town that has been a copper mining, but it had been retired. So it was a mixture of wealthy landowners and poor miners who had stayed around. So that's where I pick up some of my science and enthusiasm and mission for doing things. Combine those and you get a child who is very different. I am tall and have a certain physical makeup. My brother is shorter. I'm 5'3" when I'm stretched out, and he was 5'7". He was far more oriented to reading and intellectual skills. My background was more in working with the landscapers who were all physical. From an academic point of view, Jeff, my brother, became an engineer, and I became an agriculturist. Why did I become an agriculturist? Well, I grew up in a rural place, and so I helped harvest peas and potatoes and milk cows, and plowed the ground with horses, and sometimes went to town with a buggy. Or I didn't necessarily do that, but the neighbors would do that. So we were remote, not near a high school, so I had to go to a boarding school. And one of the boarding schools that interested the family and myself was an agricultural boarding school, where it was all male school, about 250 high school students, plus about 200 students that came in and were day students. So then I got a career in agriculture. I studied agriculture at the University of Sydney, and then taught agriculture in one of these sort of agricultural high schools that had a farm, and the students got to milk cows and groom horses and work with the land. Eventually, it was decided that this was child labor, and it was not the right thing to do. So it doesn't happen anymore. You don't get that work experience. But we, as a 11, 12, 13-year-old students, were also milking the cows and feeding the chickens and the hogs and harvesting the corn. Uh, so that gives me that sort of background. And then I came to Illinois, partially from curiosity. Everyone is interested in what makes America tick. So, and I was interested in that too. And I wanted to get a higher degree in but I wanted to do these mixed things, uh, art and education and science, and that's not been easy to do. There have always been people who do that sort of thing, but you have to find them. You have to be lucky to find them, and they're always obeying the rules of the game. They're doing new things. They're doing interesting things. And they're invariably, if they're biodiversity, they're not the specialists. They don't know the nth degree of the biochemistry of a Krebs acid cycle. They don't know the art or the education. They don't know Dewey as a specialist. We need those specialists. We need them like crazy. But we also need the generalists. So I've sort of morphed out over the years into being a generalist. And how does my art fit? Well, we need to interpret the prairie. I was sort of amazed. I asked for the local ecosystem, and it was like people didn't know that prairie was their ecosystem, and they didn't know where the remnants were, and the remnants were down to almost nothing because the soil is so rich and the rainfall is so effective that every inch is in agriculture or other development. So how do you do this? You find the little pieces, you find the botanists and the zoologists and the natural history survey people who know where these sites are, and you tag along and find them. And we have some of those sites, but it's not easy to do. And you can't get people to go out into the boondocks to look at these places, which, after all, aren't that interesting. Prairie just looks like a bunch of weeds, and people have been so oriented to the invention of a rotary mower that everything is mown, and rural sociology says that you are more respectable if your area is in mown well and cleaned and tidied than if it is with prairie that's kind of loose as a goose and looks like weeds. So the alternative is to take the picture of the prairie to the people. And that's where the art comes in. And you want those people to look at your picture and put their own imagination into it. They're not necessarily going to your prairie, but they're going to think about it. And some pictures and some sculptures, you'll walk by and you'll say, "What the hell was that?" And then you'll go back and think about it, and then we got you. So we introduce people through pictures, and we make them high contrast pictures, so that you can put your imagination, you can fill in the details, and we'll show you some of those pictures later. And I think we've probably got through our 15 minutes, and I may continue that. So we'll stop here for our Zoom attempt at Spurlock, and I'll add what I can do. The next question is, how do you make a high contrast picture? Well, you have to have a mission, an understanding. It's like being a player. If you wanting to do bridge or something like that, you have to have some experience. So first of all, you have to know the prairie. So you have to find those people who know at least a little bit about it. And they were there early on. They were in Shelford and Vestal, and later Kendi, and later still Bliss. And I'm very forever thankful for those people who allowed me to go to field trips with them and to pick up information and bring back pictures that we would put in botany studios or classrooms. Or gradually I evolved to doing about 10 years of that, working with different departments. The departments at the university usually get contingency money, which is money that's given to them to create and encourage research or other activities. So we would get support money from contingency money. And so I would sometimes be providing one picture, sometimes a slideshow. Sometimes I was asked to be a cantankerous, to sit in a classroom and ask rude questions that would spark some debate. We did that, and gradually we created a docent group. It was called a Natural Areas Study Group, and that had mainly students in it for a while. But I thought it ought to be more so that people could go out and find a prairie and come back in and talk to people. Park districts, forest preserves, and the like. And then an active volunteer came along, and she was named Anne Fireham. She was the wife of a dean, and she had a small family, but she was interested in doing things. And she asked what she could do to help. And I said, well, we need a docent group. And she took off. And very shortly, she had more of a community adult group, but she probably had best part of 50 participants, of whom 35 might come to a meeting and 6 or 8 might go to a field trip. But it was her enthusiasm and that brought that thing into action. And it's now 35 years old, and it's still full of people who are doing that sort of thing. They're enjoying the field trip, they're enjoying each other, and they recently had a first in the season after the virus in Busey Woods. So we then made a film of Busey Woods, and you can go back to YouTube and find that and see our efforts to get 60 slides of Busey Woods. And then there's a whole story of where do the interpretive people operate. So there was the Park District put in an Anita Purvis Center. And why was it called Anita Purvis? Anita Purvis was a young mother who died very early, but before she was announced to be in danger, she was a biologist working with vernal ponds. And Busey has one of these meanders that if you cut across the neck, you can drain the landscape quicker. But the cut-off meander becomes the vernal ponds, and she would investigate the vernal ponds. And so Anita Purvis is remembered at the Anita Purvis Center. It was popular. It spent $1 million expanding. It put in a place where you could look over, and you could look through a window and see bird feeders and birds. And there's a little museum, and it has owls that have one eye and can really be out in the wilds again. So they are in places where they can be observed, and there are meeting places, and it's a friendly place to be. Those photographs were mostly photographs, but what I've been asked to work with is the high contrast silkscreen prints we do. Silkscreen printing I chose because it is relatively cheap to do. Young people can do it, older people can do it. It's almost like stenciling. When I go to teach about silk screening, I sometimes take a piece of brown paper and I cut out a hole for a house, and a hole for a tree, and a hole for a bird, and a hole for a landscape. And we may have several pieces of brown paper. And if we want to print the hill, we'll print it in green. And then if we want to put a house in it, we may put it in red. If you're going to put a bird, it might be a grackle that's black. And we don't have to register things because it's loose. But then they get the idea that you can print something, and then you get their hands. They're sometimes so small, you get their hands and they take a little piece of cardboard and they squeegee the ink across that stencil. One stage better is to have a silk screen with lots of little pores, and you can block those pores with glue or with paper or photographically. And that's where the photograph comes in. If you're knowledgeable enough of the field, and if you have that sort of enthusiasm, you will see in your eye a high contrast image. It will be that tree on a hill with a moon behind it, or it will be a fence, or it will be a seed or a plant or an animal. And if you squint, you can sort of imagine how that image would look in high contrast so that somebody else could look at it and put their image in. So we set up with silkscreen press. We were in an old building, and we could put the images with wet ink on the stairwells and they have to dry. These days, if you're professional, you have an ultraviolet tunnel and you just put the T-shirt with the image on it through, and it comes out the other end and it's dry. But we would have to hang them up so that they would take half a day to dry. And but it's exciting. You get 4 or 5 people together, and somebody has to put the paper in. Somebody has to have charge of the screen with its image on it, and you have to put it down. There has to be a vacuum cleaner to hold the piece of paper or the T-shirt or whatever down. And you have to have someone who takes the paper out, and someone who looks at it to see if it has a runny spot on it that doesn't work. So there's lots of shouting at each other as you work. And then you have to label the print, and you have to number it. And so if you're going to make 100 prints, you do 100 prints. And the pores can fill in as you go along. So if the ink dries out a little bit, the image will be slightly different. If you're working with something like copper, the copper will wear out a little bit. So the buyers will want to know whether this was at the start. And at the start, when you're just learning how to do it and it's not printing properly, that's an artist's proof. And an artist's proof is sometimes quite popular because it actually shows you that this is not coming out of a computerized system. It's something that somebody had to work with, and the glitch might be a run on the side. And when you put a mat across, it doesn't really matter. So artist proofs, and then you get the early prints that are really quite crisp, and then they gradually get less crisp as you go along. If you decide to wash it with chemicals and clean up, you can get the crispness back again. But we don't always do that because it's sometimes nice to have that soft image. Going back, I have to remind you that when we take the first photograph, we take it in color and we convert it to black and white. And then we use photographic papers to make it contrast. You don't have to do that anymore. The photographic darkrooms are gone by the wayside, and you can do it on a computer. You can give it contrast, you can give it color. So we'll have one or two pictures of artwork where the same image is in different manner. We just have had a gallery where the owner of the gallery has selected about 10 different pictures of bee-balm, all the same picture, but on different papers. People don't do that very often because it gets to be a pain to buy expensive papers, and if you're going to frame them, if you have a purple background, you might not be able to put an unrelated mat. So it takes a little bit more art to do that. So that high contrast image is then put on a photosensitive paper, and the where you shine light, you can do it in the sunlight or you can do it in a studio with studio lights. The material that is interacted with the light is destroyed. So when you wash that piece of plastic with an image on it, it creates the block you're wanting. So you then very gently push the silk screen into that image. It comes up through the silk and it closes. If you're doing something very, very fine, you'll have silk made out of platinum wire and very, very close. So if you're doing electrical circuits, then you will do that. If you're Andy Warhol and you want to have an image that's like a film strip with blurriness in it, then you will get silk with just a few lines per inch. The average is about 12 lines per inch, perhaps 24 inch. The more lines of silk that you get, the more detailed it will be. So sometimes you might choose to do the rough, tough image. You have to number these things because you have that person that's going to be wanting the first crisp image. So if it's number 12, it'll be 12/over/100, which is the run that you made. And that's more or less a promise that you won't reproduce it other times. So if you only have 100 prints, it has a certain amount of rarity, and you don't destroy somebody's rarity by making the same image. Uh, uh, the original might be $30, and the reproductions that you do over and over might be $3. So you have to consider the buyer, and some of the buyers are very interested, and that gets related to the story, and they want to know who you are and what you've been doing and why you're doing this, and what makes you excited about it, and can you continue to do this when you get older? Probably not, because you lose your shoulders, you lose your legs, and some of this is energetic work. Even just to get the photographs, sometimes you have to climb over the universe to find the photographs that you want. If you want a photograph of a bridge, you may have to stand in the middle of a stream with water up to your middle in order to get a photograph of the bridge. So it's fun to do that. Then you have to store it, and we have stored images. I have about 30 or 40 of them, and we didn't never have the money to have professional storage bins where you can store an image. You have to be very careful with paper. If you pull it out and you take your fingers and put it underneath, you can create a half moon injury to the paper. So you have to be careful how you store. If you have dust and the dust gets onto the image and you pull one image across another, it will make a scratch mark. So you have to be careful to keep things clean. You cannot always go outside and print. We do that sometimes. If we're doing something rough and tough, there's a contractor come to town and he's about to exterminate your prairie, then you get out there with a silkscreen that says prairie preservation, no more, and that's rough and tough, but it's effective. And if you have paper that is plasticized, or you can have a reasonable image out in the field for 3 years and it sends a message. If you want to combine it with markers, you go to Farm and Fleet and you get markers that you put in. Sometimes when you have a fear that a prairie is going to be exterminated by road widening, we have done this. We've put 200 or 300 markers on the site, and that means that construction people have to think about what they're doing, and perhaps they have to call in a biologist to check out the nature of the prairie. And then perhaps the prairie has to be dug up and taken 9 miles to a visitor center on an expressway, so people coming in from interstate can see what prairie looks like. And you have to have something to dig the plants and put them on a trailer and drive them there. And then you have to have a hole that's dug so that a plant goes into the ground. And so that's the extension of how you work with art. Sometimes it might be that you work with numbers. You have an art professor. We wanted to put in a Black History mural. And we had an artist, Angela Rivers, and she was out of work at the time. And we could have her organize a family of youths that were not being employed otherwise. And we were providing that sort of energy. And so Angela, being the artist, would draw up the image. So yes, there were black farmers. So we had pictures of black farmers and uh, black people in different circumstances, and that image had to go on a mural. So you find a cooperating building that has a 40-foot blank wall. It might have a window or two in it, but basically a blank wall. And it's handy if that building has a toilet in it that we can use. So there's a few functionalities that you have here to have water and be able to get out of the rain occasionally. So Angela did the history, and then it's handy if you can convince the city or the public that it's not going to have a lot of phallic symbols and rude statements on it. There are muralists who come around at 5 o'clock in the morning with spray cans, and they spray images on railroad cars, and they go across the nation. Then they disappear, and but it's kind of functional and kind of nice to have the community citizens that are going to look at this know what they have. We had Lucy Gray and her husband right across from our mural, and they had two houses where black community people had to be out of the university at a certain time. It was called a sunset clause. It wasn't very official, but it was sort of known that if you were black, you weren't on campus past a certain hour. If you were academic, you might get away with it, but people used to stay in those two houses. Well, Lucy had grown up with black farming in Paris, Illinois, and other places, Bongart and places a little southeast of here. And she'd come to Champaign and met and married, and she was full of stories. But she loved this pure mural, and so did others. People from the black community would drive down this street. It was Park Street, and they would stop and give us high fives or honk the horn, and so there's community interaction. Sometimes it's a sculpted piece. I was talking last week about my sister's garden. She hadn't really thought of it as a sculpted piece. And when I put the program up on, when UPTV put the program up on YouTube, she got to read the program, and she got to realize that, yes, her yard is probably a sculpted piece. Again, artwork. And probably some influence from my mother and some influence from my father, who was a gardener. My mother and my father gardened very differently. My mother had it very organized. And my father was rough and tough with a little bit of cow manure, and the plants often grew more effectively in a loose prairie-like setting than with a very formal setting. So it's fun that they would argue about it with each other. And that is part of the artistry too, because Dad was a carpenter, a teacher, and Mother was more the seamstress. In those days, women had more set responsibilities. They were going to have children. They were going to be in the kitchen. They were going to be seamstresses. They were going to be clerical typists or nurses or librarians. That has changed dramatically, like the dresses have changed too. So in early 1900s, you'd be walking around with a dress down to your ankles. But then you didn't get to vote till 1923. But now liberation has allowed people to come a long way. Both male and female are much more close to each other in many ways. And art has helped to do that. If you look through an old journal, you'll see all the dresses, and then you'll see the commentary for males and the sport. And in the early 20s, it would be hard for you to be in a small community, and the girls would have to be on the same team as the guys. And so there's this interaction and a little bit of touchiness. And sometimes girls, because they're smart, can and they grow sooner, they mature sooner, and they can be on teams and really impress the guys. And sometimes that's something very new for parents that are male and female oriented. And it's been a lot of progress in the last 20 years. And art has really been in there. So art doesn't have to necessarily be in the art school. But one of the things we did was to run an artist in the landscape course, and really to walk into an institution where people are artists, you don't have to explain what the hell you're doing. It is something there, and somebody will push out a piece of paper and watch you draw, and they can know whether you draw. Will say, oh yeah, you can draw. It's this sort of interaction between being an educator and a biologist and an artist at the same time. And you hope that the institutions also grow to the point where they can have group activities, group teams. If you have 6 people, then it might be you have a lead person with a lot of knowledge in a certain thing, and then you might have an Italian and a woman and someone who is learning the field, and you're all learning together, and that's art can help that, music can help that, and so next door is WEFT, and we're doing remote next door, but WEFT is wonderful. It's this fundraising time now, and they have put in an antenna recently, and there again you have people who are not necessarily artists, but they're artists in their own way. To climb up a 200-foot aerial and antenna and to work on it and then climb back down takes a little talent. I've taken an old Bell telephone movie camera to the top of one of those towers, and when you're up the top, the wind is blowing, and it's a little scary, and you have to find your way down this network of iron. I think we've said enough about art here now. I think we're getting to be near the time that we like to have WEF put in a plug for their activities, their fundraising, and the report to the Arts Council in the state, so they get to apply for grant money. And that's a question for us too, because if you're an artist and an educator and a scientist, and you want to do art, then often you can't apply for funds from the Arts Council because it deals with art. Go to the biologist and get your money from the biologist, and the biologist, I want you to be a biologist. If you and then there's the educators that might be a little more oriented to both. It's uh, it is the mix that often is at the community level, uh, to do things with a sculpted piece, to have a race, to run, to dance, to dance, and to dance your own dance, and to sing. To Jan Kalmar runs a singing group over and over with just 8 or 10 people, and then there's Amazon, and Janet belongs to Amazon, as do a lot of other women, and that's creative. And how do you do it and have a family at the same time? And we've got a long way to go with a lot of these sorts of things. Okay, this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.